Probably the key term here is this one here on the bottom of the screen, domestication. Domestication is the term for when these plants and animals have been modified to be used by human beings. So it's important to keep in mind that the ancestors of today's cows and the ancestors of today's wheat and corn are plants that occurred naturally in the landscape. Human beings didn't invent these things, but they didn't look like they do now before human beings started messing around with them. Human beings, because of their interactions with these plants, have actually changed them. They have domesticated them. The actual definition of the term domestication, as we're going to use it here, is when plants or animals have been modified on a genetic level through their interactions with human beings. So I'll say that again. Domestication is when human intervention modifies plants or animals on a genetic level. All right, well, how the heck do they do that? Okay, this is not 10,000 years ago people with DNA sequencers and splicing genes into, the genes of a pig into a tomato or whatever they're doing now. Genetic change happens naturally. It happens as part of the natural process we call natural selection. We talked about at the evolution section of this course. But it can also happen in the exact same mechanism. This is one of the ways that we have actually confirmed and observed evolution happening. It can happen through human intervention as well. The way human beings actually interfere with which plants or animals get to reproduce. Instead of natural selection, it's artificial selection, meaning humans actually make a choice about which plants or animals should reproduce because those are the ones that benefit humans. And over successive generations, that choice, those series of choices that humans make, modify the animal or the plant in a really substantial way genetically. This isn't something that human beings were sitting there thinking about. They aren't thinking, well, I just know that if I mess with plants this way, their DNA will change, and that's going to help me out, right? DNA was understood and discovered, well, it was discovered early, but understood only in the 1950s as the means of genetic communication. What human beings were doing were perfectly practical, obvious things to them. They were going out and gathering wild resources, say a plant, seeds from a plant. But the seeds from the plant that are most likely to be affected by human action are the ones that fit human needs. So they're going after the plants that they like. And they're taking those plants, the ones they were gathering anyway, and planting them. And by planting them, they're actually affecting which of those plants survive until the next generation. Which of those plants are more likely to reproduce? Because they're giving those plants that they've put into their field a big advantage over the ones that are just out there on the landscape. They're cutting down the trees, they're pulling up the weeds. Those plants are going to have it really easy, a good time of growing, and they're going to grow and produce more seeds that are like them. When you're out in the landscape gathering seeds to eat, and when you're thinking about which seeds you might want to plant, the biggest seeds are going to be the most useful to you because they're going to be the ones that provide the most food. But also just really practically, they're going to be the ones that you're least likely to drop while you're carrying those seeds in from the landscape. A little tiny difference, you go and gather a few thousand seeds for a couple of meals, but you're dropping the little tiny ones as you're carrying them back to your house. And before you put them into the ground, it's the biggest ones already that are going to get that advantage of which ones get planted, and those are the ones that are going to start being grown and cultivated by human beings. This is images of wheat seeds from two different levels of the site called Abu Huraira. This is what the wheat grains look like that are recovered from the really early levels of Abu Huraira. They're wild. They are exactly like the ones you would find out in the landscape even today in the place where wheat naturally occurs, the sort of Syria, northern Iraq, northern Iran area where this food comes from. After a couple of hundred years, maybe 1,000 years, of human beings making a really major point of gathering these resources and managing them, sticking them in the ground where they're going to grow better, picking the ones they like to keep and reproduce the next year, dropping the ones that are too small to be useful. The seeds themselves, the plants themselves, have been modified genetically. They've actually split from the original wild species, and this is what the seeds look like. It doesn't look like a huge difference, but genetically speaking, all these seeds are pretty different than the ones that are up here. They're a whole lot bigger. The biggest change, though, the one that's really kind of spectacular, is this little plant right here. It's something called teosinte. This is what it looks like now. It's a wild plant. You still can find it out in the landscape. But this is also what they all looked like. Then human beings started making a real point of gathering these plants, planting them, and picking the best from that batch to plant every year. And really, really quickly, we got a big, big change. Does anyone know what this would be today? Does it look at all familiar? No, it's not wheat. What's that? No? I heard it in the back when you say corn. This is a 3,000-year cross-section of teosinte cobs from about 5,000 BCE, so I had the date slightly off, about 7,000 years ago is when this process started, to about 2,000 years ago, to about 0 CE. In just that span of time, the corn grew from this tiny little thing that would never get much bigger than this, kind of like the mini corns you can kind of get in a can sometime down here, to a cob that is familiar to all of us today. That is not the result of random chance. That is the result of human beings saying, I like this one, I don't like this one, tossing that out, and farming ones that look like this, continuing a trend and doing that generation after generation after generation every single year, and making a plant which is really radically different. The same process can take place with animals as well. If you're hunting the ancestor of today's cattle and you manage to catch one alive, there's an advantage to keeping it alive as long as you can, because once you kill it, that meat's going to start going bad. And if you keep it alive, it's going to last a lot longer. You kill one and you catch one alive, a cow is an awful lot of meat for a little group of 30 or 40 people. You need to keep that other one alive for a couple of weeks until you've eaten the first one. Well, if you capture 3 or 4, you're going to try to keep them all alive for as long as possible. But which ones are going to be the ones that you're going to knock off first? The really, really big, scary one, right? The one that you are just like, you're worried that thing is going to break out of its rope middle of the night and kill you all. The one that's really wild, that's really angry at you. Which one's going to be the last one to go? The one that's just sort of standing there in the corner going like, what is going on around here? I'm just going to sit here and hope they forget that I'm here, right? The cow that's just standing there, the bull that's just standing there is going to last longer. It's possible, after they've continued to do this for a long period of time, they're going to keep those animals alive for weeks, months, years. Eventually, those animals might start having other animals, which are never going to have known being out in the wild. They're going to be domesticated, and they're going to be changing genetically in terms of their reactions to things, but also in just straightforward, simple things, in terms of size. Cows, pretty big, if any of you have spent much time right near a cow, but they're a lot smaller than their ancestors a couple of thousand years ago before they were domesticated. The really big, scary cows and bulls were the ones that got killed first, or the ones that never got caught by humans to begin with. The smaller, more manageable ones are the ones that are going to be kept around, and that's how the genetic changes are going to occur in plants and animals. So human beings are messing with that process that's the same process that evolution uses, right, natural selection, but human beings are altering the forces that are being selected for. Picking things like the textbook goes on some length about picking a strong rachis over a brittle rachis, right, when you're dealing with wheat seeds. So when someone is going around harvesting wild wheat, which is where you're going to get the seeds to do the planting that you're going to do when you start doing it, the seeds are going to fall off if they have a brittle rachis, this connection between the seed and the plant that they're growing from. But what you actually want, it sounds like you want it to be brittle, you want it to be easy to take it off, but you don't. You want those seeds to ripen and get big and meaty and juicy and useful, but stay all connected in this nice, useful way on one stalk of wheat. So all you have to do is grab that stalk of wheat and you've got 15, 20, 30 of these little things coming back to your house. If they start breaking as that happens, well, what you're doing there is you're sowing the seeds literally for a genetic predisposition towards a brittle rachis as wild plants out there in the world. But the ones that come back to your settlement, they're going to be the ones who are genetically predisposed to having a stronger rachis, the more ripe and yet the still strongly attached to the plant. So we've been talking about how this process has taken place, this big change, and it really is a big change for the plants as much as for the people, going from teosinte up here to these little tiny corn cobs all the way up to the thing that we eat now off the cob in the summer on the right-hand side. So it raises sort of the question of why this big change is happening. I mean, human beings have been living for millions of years, or anatomically modern humans at least have been living for well over 100,000 years, doing the same thing. Day in, day out, every person who ever lived as part of our species was a gatherer-hunter. And when we talk a little more about the results of this, it's going to be, we will raise some questions as to why the people started to make this bizarre as well as huge change and become farmers. We'll come back to this slide a fair bit, so no need to write it all down at the beginning. We can start by asking the question of why did this happen? The book makes fun of this idea of sort of a eureka moment, right? This sudden realization. This is page 136, 137 of the textbook. And Fagin is really sort of poking fun at these guys. Victorian scientists believed agriculture to be a brilliant invention fostered by a rare genius. One day, when in this scenario, a solitary forager was carrying home a bundle of grasses, she stumbled, spilling some of her load onto the damp ground. I think, by the way, he's giving the Victorian scientists a lot of credit here when he assumes that they would have imagined that a woman had anything to do with something that was important in human history. But we are now pretty clear that that's most likely the way the people who are most directly involved in this for a number of reasons. So Fagin's giving them a benefit of the doubt here. But a few days later, she passed the same way and noticed small green shoots are sprouting from the soil. With startling insight, the woman realized the potential of her new invention. Planting more seeds near her hut, she fed her family off the bountiful harvest. Others copied her example soon, and agriculture was born. Ta-da! All done. This is not a great set of ideas about how people in the past thought. For one, it really kind of sells them short on a number of levels. This kind of assumes that people in the past were pretty stupid, actually. If you're imagining as a gatherer-hunter, a person who lives in the environment but doesn't do at least a great deal to the environment to change it, at least compared to farming, you are going to be completely dependent on the things that flower at a certain time of year, that give fruit at a certain time of year, the animals that come in and that leave your area. You're going to really know about the details. To imagine that an ancient person 12,000 years ago didn't understand that seeds produced plants is really to imagine, it's kind of to boggle the mind. I think that's not realistic. People are familiar with these things. People actually, for a very long time, before they became farmers in a formal sense, managed the plants and animals around them pretty actively. So here's an image I think I may have used before. It's a 1903 or something painting. You obviously don't need to know that. It's a sort of a Western U.S. painting dealing with people who were alive at that time. So this is not 10,000 years ago, right? Native Americans are not quote-unquote living in the past. They are living in the present as much as everyone else, and they were 100 years ago too. But what it's showing is an example of Native people sort of starting a small brush fire here. And what they're doing in that picture is actually managing the landscape that they're living in. And this is something we have really good evidence for in a lot of places. I have a colleague who spends a lot of time looking at fire ecology in California, where Native peoples have clearly been managing that landscape for 6,000 to 8,000 years, even though they never really became farmers in any formal sense. They were very well aware of what happens when a forest fire comes through naturally, and they noticed that a whole lot of things that are very useful to them pop up soon after that's done. And at a certain point, a forest stops being useful to them for what they needed until there's another fire that comes through. And so they started setting fires. And they did it in a very organized, conscious, and careful way to encourage the growth of certain kinds of plants and the animals that like to eat those plants, and encourage their ability to hunt them. So I think we can sort of imagine that this eureka moment idea is not a particularly good description of this process. So let's think about some of the other ideas that might have explained why people have started to produce food at this time in human history after 100,000 years of not being food producers in any substantial sense compared to what we're talking about now. The first theory we're going to talk about is that of this guy right here. His name is V. Gordon Childe, and he's really one of the first systematic theorists in archaeology. He's really one of the first archaeologists who paid pretty careful attention to data and used data to support his arguments. I know this sounds like a shocking idea. This shouldn't be that unusual an idea for us now, but in its earliest days, archaeology was sort of subject to a lot of the problems of science and pseudosciences of the late 19th century, early 20th century. The critical thinking that we're doing here, the arguments built on evidence, was not necessarily a big part of the work that was done. And so people sort of looked at what they saw and came up with an explanation or a guess, and the first one that came to their mind was the one that they would stick to. And V. Gordon Childe decided that he was going to do things a little bit differently, and he really worked much more systematically. He didn't just go out to see what he could find, but he went out with a research question, and he went out trying to figure out what he should dig up where in order to answer that research question. By the way, he probably doesn't look particularly familiar, but does he, this picture kind of remind you of anyone?
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Asps. Very dangerous. You go first.
In fact, the hat is in fact connected to our friend Indiana Jones. This may be the last time we'll see Indiana Jones in this class, so we'll bid Indy adieu. But V. Gordon Childe was part of the inspiration for Indiana Jones, the character. I think it was a pretty loose adaptation. All right, so Childe, he came up with this idea that we'll call the oasis theory. And he looked at the timing of when domestication happened. And he was doing this at a time before carbon-14 dating. In fact, unfortunately, he passed away the year before carbon-14 dating was sorry, just a few years after carbon-14 dating came in. It came out about 1948. But it didn't actually figure into his main work. And before that, we really didn't have any specific way of saying exactly how old things were. We had some good educated guesses, and they turned out to be not entirely wrong, but his chronology wasn't perfect. As near as he could figure, the change between being gatherers and hunters and farming for the very first time happened in the Middle East, and he was correct about that. And he thought that it happened probably right at the very end of the last ice age. And now we think there may well have been a little bit of a gap there, but the numbers could go in a couple of different directions. And so Childe, they recognized some elements of geology, and he recognized that the Earth changed a whole lot between 15,000, 18,000 years ago and 10,000, 12,000 years ago, the time that he's saying the first farming was going on. We know in Northern Europe, it would have been covered with glaciers, the steppe in sort of Central Europe, and in the Middle East, he imagined that the change maybe was one where things got drier and drier and drier. Because he looked around and he said, well, the Middle East is full of deserts right now. There must have been a big change at the end of the last ice age. I assume that it was wetter and more lush, and that these deserts are what happened in the last 10 or 12,000 years. Now he suggested that as the water dried up, that started concentrating everything that needed water. So you've got these big desert landscapes here, but you've got little oases here where trees will grow, grasses will grow, animals will come to drink. People have the same needs that these plants and animals do right now. All the water, all the land animals we know now depend on water to some extent, and the plants too. And so Childe imagined that as he thought the environment got more and more arid, the water sources got fewer and fewer and farther between, more of these plants and animals and humans would all have to come together at oases. Whether they wanted to or not, they would be stuck into the same ecological niche. Everyone would be relying on the same oases. And it would have been at this time that he suggested that people started to observe plants and animals and get to understand them more in depth and recognize that they had the opportunity to actually control them.